मैं इस डिक्लेरेशन को एडॉप्ट करने की घोषणा करता हूं।
Number of outcomes it has, both the outcomes and the annexed documents are about 112, which is more than 2.5 times, which is
Hello and welcome to this special broadcast. Yes, the G20 summit is drawing to a close. Well, not just yet. We've got one full day. Negotiations will take place tomorrow as well. The final presidency press conference will take place at 1 p.m. tomorrow. Currently, all the leaders are in a gala dinner on the 9th floor of the ITPO, very close to where I'm standing right now. And you've got an all-vegetarian fare for the leaders. You've got street food. You've got millets as well, cuisines from all across the country. And there is background music going on. There is instrumental music. What we've been told is that this is going to be a quiet, somber affair. Yes, a lavish spread, but the atmosphere has been created for the leaders to have a conversation with each other. So you're probably seeing those visuals on your screens. It's been a hectic day of bilaterals for Prime Minister Narendra Modi as well. He is holding at least 15 bilaterals over these 2 days of the G20 summit. Some important ones from among them are the Indo-US bilateral, the India-EU bilateral, the India-UK bilateral as well. He met Rishi Sunak this evening and there were negotiations on the free trade agreement and giving pace to those talks as well. I'd like to talk about the Delhi declaration. That was a big outcome because there was a big question mark over the last 1 year whether there will be a joint communique or not. But finally, India has managed to achieve consensus. There were 7 to 8 paragraphs on the Russia-Ukraine war, but there was a dilution from the Bali declaration. Words like deploring Russia's war against Ukraine, urging Russia to get out of Ukraine territory, condemning the war in Ukraine, all those wordings and lines were removed from the declaration in order to have consensus. So that has been achieved. India made the point of emerging economies really pushing and helping India convince the G7. Let me introduce all our guests right now. We have Michael Kugelman, Director, South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center, Raymond Vickery, Senior Associate, Center for Strategic and International Studies, Subhrakant Panda, President of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Michael Kugelman, how do you see this declaration? We saw the West unanimously condemning the war that Russia has been waging for the last 1 year. We felt that there would be no communique. Finally, how do you think the US came around to agreeing with India, with some of the emerging economies on the wording of the war?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me as always. I think first of all, we just have to take a step back and acknowledge that in all of the previous ministerial level meetings of the G20 under India's presidency, there had not been any type of document at all, including in those meetings on climate change and so on, where one would have thought that there could have been a consensus. So I think it's a pretty significant feat that we do have this consensus document. And in terms of Ukraine, yeah, I mean, certainly you're right. The language is not as strong against Russia as it was the case last year, but that was necessary because the key was to reach a consensus, and that was not going to happen if you were to include that type of language. Russia had said before the summit that it would not sign on to any document that essentially would take that position against the Russian position. But I think in terms of Washington here, I think that the U.S. position has been something that appeared in the document, and that is that we need to focus, regardless of what you think about this war, we need to focus on the incredibly damaging economic consequences that have come from it. And that was acknowledged in the document. It essentially said that the G20, doesn't need to focus on geopolitical or security issues, but it's important to note that the economic consequences are significant, have major global implications. And I think for that reason, the U.S. was willing to sign on to the document. It had its position stated.
Right. Subhrakant, Panda, welcome to this broadcast. Yes, a lot of cheer here at the media center because the Delhi declaration is done. The Prime Minister announced that. There was a thumping of desks as well. But I'd like to ask you about one more big deliverable that has come out. The infrastructure corridor deal between India, Middle East and Europe that has been agreed upon. US also played a role in getting this off the ground. This is a counter to the Belt and Road Initiative. How important do you think this could be for the Indian industry? What kind of potential do you see?
Good evening, Parikshit. Always a pleasure to be talking to you. First, if I may take the liberty of commenting on your previous question, just a minute on that. I think it's a tribute to India's capabilities in terms of diplomacy, in terms of its leadership, that we have a declaration. Now, having said that, let me get on to your question about the new India, Middle East, European Union corridor, which has been announced. I think it is a very, very significant initiative, and I don't say it only in the context of being seen or juxtaposed against the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think in and of itself, it is something which is significant. It takes forward India's belief in infrastructure, which enhances connectivity, which in other words will bring about greater trade possibilities. It will make movement of goods easier. And I think this is something which holds a lot of potential as far as Indian industry is concerned, because I was reading a quick analysis of it, and it has the potential to boost trade by up to 40%, is what I recall reading. And besides that, I think again, apart from the role played by the US in bringing this together, I think it is also brings about greater role for India in various groupings of world powers, and in all these contexts and more. I think it's an extremely significant initiative, one that I welcome, and one, as I said, I believe holds a lot of potential for Indian businesses.
Right. Raymond, Vickery, welcome to the show. How do you read this infrastructure deal that has been announced? It was announced by the Prime Minister a few hours back at the G20 meeting. The US had been speaking about this. How important is this for the United States? They had been pushing it closely. Raymond, Vickery, your thoughts?
Well, thanks very much for having me. I agree that this is an important inflection point, having a consensus on this. I would point out that from the very first, the United States, unlike China or Russia, has been supportive of India and its efforts to make sure that this summit was successful. And that extends all the way from President Biden showing up a day early and having dinner with the Prime Minister, and most importantly, to support of these infrastructure proposals and developments, and more importantly, the ways to finance them. I think it is very important for the bilateral context, which was furthered, as you know, when Prime Minister Modi was in Washington in June, and this is a part of the commitment between these two great democracies to work together to bring peace and prosperity to the world. I would say that in regard to the language about Ukraine, the language, of course, is acceptable and sets forth all the basic principles. I think one of the most important parts of the declaration is a need for Russia to re-implement the grain deal so that there can be the flow of grain to third world. This is not a time for war is in there. So all the right words are in there. And the question now is, after having talked the talk, can you walk the walk? What is it that you are specifically going to do in terms of greater financing through the World Bank, the reforms there, the support of this rail corridor linking India, the Middle East, and Europe, on climate change, actually getting the funding in there? And yes, what are you going to do about getting Russia to start playing by the rules which are espoused in the document? That you don't use force, that you don't use threats of nuclear weapons. And the same thing goes for China when it claims a part of India, Arunachal Pradesh, as its own, when it seeks to get its way by threats of force.
Okay, Michael Kugelman, coming back to you, how do you read U.S. support for India in this G20? We saw several visits by Janet Yellen through the year, at least 2 visits by Antony Blinken, the U.S. Defense Secretary, the U.S. Commerce Secretary was also here. So considering all those high-level visits from the United States, the NSA, Jake Sullivan as well, all of this had been building up for G20 and a closer India-U.S. partnership. But do you think in terms of the consensus within the G7 on the communique, on what India was trying to do with the Delhi Declaration, do you think it was finally the U.S. which would have nudged the rest of the G7 to move along with the Delhi Declaration?
Well, I mean, I'm not privy to the the internal deliberations on the negotiations, though I do think to your initial question about where the U.S. stands with India within the summit, I think they very much are seeing eye to eye. In the days leading up to the summit, the messaging from the U.S. government, including from the White House, was very similar to the messaging we were hearing from India, and that was this idea of ensuring that the challenges and the needs of the global South are taken into account by the entire G20 membership, and I think that was one of President Biden's goals, to ensure that these types of global challenges that tend to impact the global South disproportionately. Things like climate change, food insecurity, energy insecurity, some of these, of course, have been worsened by the war in Ukraine. These are the issues that President Biden wanted to focus, obviously, along with other things, too, like Ukraine and so on. But I do think that, this is, of course, a relationship, as I think my friend Ray mentioned earlier, this is a relationship that is really enjoying a lot of momentum, especially since Prime Minister Modi's state visit here several months ago. And I think it's important that Biden arrived early so that the two of them could meet and enable them to ensure that the momentum over the last few months and the last year will continue to be in place, especially because both countries, the U.S. and India, will be having an election next year, and each government is going to be increasingly focused on campaigning. So it's important, I think, for the two top leaders to ensure that there's still much to build on, that there's still things to talk about, and that the momentum of recent months can continue. And finally, I think a mark of a good partnership, of a strong partnership, is one that has deep levels of bilateral cooperation, and you certainly have that with the U.S. and India, but it's important that they also cooperate in multilateral settings. So that's why I think that the G20 is such an important forum where the U.S. and India can work closely together. And I should also say, on the question of the infrastructure deal, I do think that's a really big deal. And I think that it allows the U.S. and India to work together in regions outside of Asia. Again, another reflection of an important partnership. They're cooperating a lot in the Indo-Pacific, but this is important that they could take their partnership into the Middle East as well.
Right. Absolutely. Taking the partnership to the Middle East as well. But let me get in Subhrakant Panda once again. Subhrakant Panda, as we speak about that infrastructure corridor deal, another important inclusion into the G20 was the African Union. Now, African Union will be a permanent member of the G20. This is a big market for us, for our exports and for critical minerals. How do you see the entry of African Union into the G20? And considering that this was a project that India had been pushing for, what potential do you see for India in the African Union, closer ties between India and Africa?
So that's a very important question, and I think the inclusion of the African Union in the G20 while India was the president is a significant development. And I think the economic aspects, the critical minerals aspects, all of that comes a little later on. But what this shows is India and Prime Minister Modi's deep commitment to inclusivity. And, the Prime Minister talks about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, which is everybody working together for development. And that comes through very, very clearly in this measure. But having said that, if we now look at the economic aspect of it, the fact remains that Africa is a significant geography. It has 6 of the world's 12 fastest growing economies, huge potential in terms of growth, huge potential, like you said, in terms of critical minerals, which of course has a significant role to play going ahead. If you look at the proportion of uncultivated land throughout the world, that's where a lot of potential lies in Africa. And not to mention that when India talks about championing the voice of the global South, how can you have that without Africa being part of it? Africa needs to benefit more from the shared outcomes that India's presidency seeks to achieve, and therefore it was very, very important that the African Union was part of this on a more permanent basis, rather than leave it to individual presidencies to include them or not. So I think, and it speaks volumes for India's, again, diplomacy, that we were able to work it out. Prime Minister Modi's commitment, and I'm sure he must have used a lot of leverage and political capital to make this happen. To get Africa included, I think, was very important. And now the benefits that will follow, I think, are there for both sides, and in fact for the globe. It's not just for Africa or for India, but I think the world will benefit from this development.
Right. Raymond, Vickery, what do you think about the role that China played in this G20? There were a lot of questions about Xi Jinping snubbing India, Premier Li Qiang coming here. He did not seek any bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi. We've not heard of any pull aside either. So what do you think about China's presence, if you were to reflect on it?
Well, I think China wants to move away from the G20. It recognizes it is an effective forum for democracies being able to work together and to bridge gaps. And it particularly China did not want to see India have a success. China claiming an entire India state, other portions of the territory, saying that it has a Belt and Road which sucks developing nations into its orbit. All of those things would put China in a position to not want to have this be a success. It wants to go with a forum like BRICS, where it thinks it can have more sway and be more of the decision maker. But I think when China got here and saw the work which had been done by India, the United States, and others, it had to pull back. It could not be the skunk at the party, as we might say in the South in the United States. And so it laid back. I think the same thing can be said for Russia, but make no mistake that the underlying difficulties are still there and still need a lot of work.
All right. My final question to Michael Kugelman. Michael, considering that Subramaniam Jaishankar said that it was the emerging market economies which really made sure there was consensus on the Delhi Declaration and the differences over the Ukraine-Russia war were bridged. What do you think India really takes away from this presidency as a victory?
Well, I think, quite frankly, there are a number of victories that India can take away from this. First of all, I think it wanted to push back against criticism it's gotten from many countries, as well as some critics in India, that India, talks a big game, so to speak, about the role it can play as a global leader, but it doesn't actually follow through. It doesn't come through. It has, in a really big way here, with its G20 leadership, convening a record number of meetings, showcasing its convening power by drawing a record number of delegates to the Leaders Summit, and now coming out with this consensus document when many thought that it wouldn't be possible. But I think above all that, it is the issue of making the G20, truly making the G20 into an entity that reflects the world and the global economy on the whole. Indeed, it had been emphasizing again and again the need to focus on the concerns of the global South. And as I think was mentioned before, best way to do that is to invite in the African Union. And not surprisingly, that was a move that everyone agreed with within the G20. So I think that's really a reason for victory and success there. And now I think there's still a few more months that India has before it turns over the presidency to Brazil. And I imagine that it will want to continue on those same themes to ensure that momentum. But we live in a moment when there is very real concern that you're going to see these Western powers retreating to their preferred entities and non-Western powers retreating to their preferred entities, raising concerns that you'd have the G7 and then you'd have BRICS. That's why the G20 is so important, because it brings together Western and non-Western powers and members of the global South, which is so important at a moment when the biggest global challenges are borderless, and you really need all key global players working together under one roof, so to speak. And I think India has helped that happen with its efforts as the G20 chair.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael Kugelman, Subhrakant, Panda, for joining us with the industry perspective. Very important views there from Subhrakant, Panda, and also from Raymond, Vickery of CSIS. Thank you very much for joining us on this program. So that was a wrap of our coverage from G20. But before we end this broadcast, let's